Good afternoon. My name is Karen Greenberg. I'm the director of the Center on National Security here at Fordham Law. I really am happy all of you came here on this cold day in the middle of the afternoon. As I think I mentioned last week, we're trying out the 4 o'clock slot, and it seems to be working perfectly fine, so you can expect to have more of these. I am joined today by an old friend and colleague, Thomas Hegghammer, who comes to us from Norway, but I want to tell you a little bit about what he's done and who he is in the world of terrorism and terrorism studies. And he'll discount anything I say, so don't look at him during this part. Thomas is generally considered by many of the people in the policy establishment and the legal establishment and then the terrorism studies establishment as one of the best experts on Al-Qaeda, on Al-Qaeda radicalization, and on the evolution of Al-Qaeda from a decade ago or more to now. And he's focused on all different geographical areas of Al-Qaeda, both Saudi Arabia and the countries around Saudi Arabia, on North Africa, and in some ways, his turning his attention to the United States is interesting for this country. Thomas has spent a lot of time in this country as a terrorism expert. He's been a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center. Is that where you were? At Princeton, or were you?
The Near East.
The Near East Study, at Bernie Hakel's Near East. He's been at the Kennedy School at Harvard. He was with me at the Center on Law and Security at NYU. He's now at Stanford. He's a well-kept secret. If we need to know something, we can call him up and ask him the answer, and then sound really smart in public. But let me tell you what he actually does for a living, because from a policy point of view, it's a word of wisdom to the United States, which is that he works for something called the Norwegian Defense Research Establishment. And what it essentially is a think tank, and you can talk about this if you want. It's a think tank that advises the defense ministry and the government on terrorism and other issues. And I went there about a year ago to meet with Thomas and a number of his colleagues, who are as well known in their specific lanes of terrorism, which are a little different than Thomas's, as he is. So what Norway has actually done, without anybody really writing about it or talking about it, is create a body of experts on terrorism, on violent extremism, on countering violent extremism, on understanding the use of the internet. I can't even tell you how much of what goes on there. And it's nice to see a government that has the resources and the focus and the determination to do something like that. So I came away kind of jealous. Anyway, so he's written a paper which he's been working on for a very long time, and which we distributed to any of you who signed up, and which we have copies of outside if you want one on the way. And this paper is about many things at the same time, and I was hoping today we would be able to parse through some of the issues. So I thought I have a lot of questions, but I think for purposes of just in case anybody hasn't read it, I thought we would give Thomas 5 or 10 minutes, 5 minutes, to talk about I guess I want to couch this 2 ways. Not just what this paper is about, but I'm going to tell you my first question when you finish, so you can think about it while you're talking, which is, I know you got involved in this because you're one of those people who's been studying the region and studying violent extremism and studying jihadi terrorism. So 2 things I'm really interested in are what surprised you when you did this research? I mean, how much of what you set out that you thought you were looking at, you actually found? In other words, if you start with saying, people's premises about this are wrong. I want to know if your premise was wrong to start with, or not. You were just just came from birth that you understood this. And the second thing is, I think that in order to give this talk, you should start by defining what you mean by jihadis, and jihadism. And so maybe it will be 10 minutes. But anyway, go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much for this very generous introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. I'll just summarize briefly the gist of the paper. Although I assume all of you hold subscriptions to the American Political Science Review and read it over a glass of wine on Friday evening. The basic point is that Islamists view foreign fighting and terrorism as two different things, and that they consider foreign fighting as a more legitimate activity than international terrorism. And for this reason, you have many more foreign fighters than you have international terrorists. It's a lower kind of barrier to it's a lower entry type of activity. So what this does is that it challenges two very important assumptions in the study of terrorism and also in counter-terrorism practice. The first, the two are related. The first one is that foreign fighters are, as a group, very dangerous. And this assumption is, of course, based on the correct observation that many of the plotters in terrorist attacks in the West in the past 10, 15 years have had a history of foreign fighting. They trained in camps in Afghanistan and elsewhere. And that these individuals were crucial to the plot's success. They often acted as entrepreneurs and so on. The assumption is wrong, or it has to be modified, because most analysts, I think, forgot to think of the fact that they were selecting on the dependent variable, as we say. They were looking only at the foreign fighters who had come back and engaged in terrorism. They forgot that many foreign fighters, in fact, as I show, the vast majority of foreign fighters don't come back. So there's something in the denominator there that we hadn't thought of, and so there's only a small. I'm showing in the paper that there's only a small fraction of the foreign fighters who actually return and become involved in terrorism. So as a group, the foreign fighters are somewhat less dangerous than many have assumed. But of course, as I also underline in the paper, the ones who do come back are dangerous because they are more effective killers than people who have not had the training. And relatedly, the second assumption that I'm challenging is that all the Western jihadists who leave as foreign fighters do so in order to train and come back. The assumption is that they have to be treated as terrorists in the making because their plan, their master plan, is to go out, train, come back, and hit us harder. That they engage in. That their choice to go abroad is a strategic sort of act of deferred gratification. They're trained to be able to hit us harder down the road. What I show is that this is implausible. That there really isn't very much hard evidence to this effect. The actual evidence suggests that the vast majority of people who leave generally have the intention of just fighting abroad. They don't have the intention of coming back and attacking us here. Some people do acquire that motivation along the way, later on, when they're out in the field, but they don't have it at the outset. And as I already said, only some of them acquire that motivation. And these findings have important implications, I think, for how we think about radicalization and counterterrorism here, and also how we practice it, how we handle, how we deal with, especially foreign fighters, people who want to become foreign fighters. So, should I address your question about what surprised me the most? So, I guess I didn't have any big surprises, but one of the most interesting things that I didn't anticipate was the change over time in the relative popularity of foreign fighting versus domestic fighting. I expected this ratio to be roughly constant, that didn't know exactly what the ratio would be. Would it be 3-to-1, or 5-to-1, or 10-to-1 in favor of foreign fighters? As it turns out, for the whole period, it's at least 3-to-1. But the picture is very different in the 90s and the 2000s. So in the 90s, you had many more foreign fighters per domestic fighter, and in the 2000s, you start getting many more, fewer foreign fighters to the domestic fighting. So domestic fighting becomes much more legitimate, relatively speaking, in the eyes of radicalists in the West.
So let's just define that. By domestic fighting, you mean people who find a target that's in the United States, or it could be France if we were talking about France, but that they find a local target rather than a foreign target. So you talk a little bit about why this happens. Can you play with that a little bit? What do you account for that change in statistics? The relative rise of the domestic fighter.
Right, so I think there are two main reasons. One is a change in constraints. So before 9/11, most Western governments considered foreign fighting as relatively harmless. Relatively little was done to prevent people from leaving as foreign fighters, and relatively little was done to track them. So there were a few lower constraints on foreign fighting. Whereas the constraints on domestic fighting, we can call it terrorism, are always high, because no state wants terrorism in their territory. But what happened after 9/11, of course, is that we started viewing foreign fighters as very dangerous, and they started to be treated practically like terrorists. And it became much harder to travel to places like Afghanistan or Chechnya. So the constraints on foreign fighting increased relatively much more than the constraints on domestic fighting. Constraints on domestic fighting probably increased as well, as part of the general kind of post 9/11 CT boost, but probably not as much in relative terms as the international barriers. So that's one factor. The other factor, I think, was on the motivation side. On the motivation side in the jihadi movement, the Al-Qaeda project of attacking America, of attacking the West first, was controversial in the Islamist community, even in the jihadi movement before 9/11. After 9/11, it became much more popular. The supply of recruits to Al-Qaeda actually increased after 9/11, and the general, you could witness a growth in the popularity of this project on the internet and elsewhere in the years after 9/11. You had more and more clerics, radical clerics, saying, issuing fatwas to the effect that it's actually okay to attack the West. So you had basically a change on the motivation side and in the constraint side, which I think accounts for most of this increase in domestic fighting.
Just for clarification, the idea of jihad, violent jihad, and the fatwa as not being applied to the West particularly was, before 9/11, it was different. Is that what you're arguing?
Well, there's always a spectrum of views on this. There's never been consensus in there, especially in the Islamist community, over what is a legitimate jihad and what is a legitimate form of violence in the context of that jihad. What I'm saying is that even among the group of activists that call them the jihadi movement, people who were inclined to use violence for some political aim, even in this group, the notion of attacking the West was unpopular. For some, it was about norms, that it was illegitimate to attack civilians in the West, that they considered that there were Islamic legal considerations which which went against it. But for others, it was more of a practical consideration that that it would be bad for the movement. It would wake up the American military machine. It would come after them and destroy it, which was to some extent true. But I think what happened, one of the reasons why the project got more wind in the sails was that those pragmatists were sort of became optimistic in the months and years immediately after 9/11. Perhaps also with the Iraq War, they thought that maybe after all they could stand a chance, that this strategy could work.
I'm a little concerned about this notion, not necessarily yours, but the idea that foreign fighters if they go abroad, well then we don't have to pay attention to them because they're only going to hurt other people, they're only going to hurt. So, you know what I'm saying? I mean, there's a little bit of that in there. So how does that play out both in the policy establishment and in your mind? Why isn't it just as important to view this from a global security stance and not just a national security stance?
Well, I'm not saying that foreign fighters are harmless, that we should let them all go without any further thoughts. The main thing I'm saying is that we should not treat them as terrorists. We should not treat them all as plotters, because that is effectively what some analysts have done by counting attempted foreign fighting as domestic terrorist plots. This is done in several recent studies on homegrown terrorism in America. The incident overviews includes cases of foreign fighting in the plot overview. And some of the sentencing, I think, of foreign fighter activism is influenced by this notion that they are terrorists in the making. If you compare the sanction on Islamist foreign fighting to the sanctions on non-Islamist foreign fighting, because that happens too. I mean, there are Americans who go and fight in other people's wars in other places, and if they are ever sanctioned, it's much later. Historically, and also today, there were Americans in Libya fighting, and with rebels there. So, which, by the way, points to sort of a legal problem or perhaps a practical problem of application. If you're going to have a law that prevents any form of foreign fighting, presumably you want a law that you can apply relatively consistently. But it's such a common phenomenon historically, and at some point you're also going to end up you're going to have problems applying it consistently.
Okay, so one of the things that shows up most commonly in serious terrorism cases, and I hate making any statement like that, but it's a fact, is the idea of going abroad. Not necessarily to be a foreign fighter, but the idea of going abroad. If you're going to what is perceived as training in a foreign terrorist training camp or having access to members of Al-Qaeda, so it's training that's an issue. And the symbol of training, the way we identify it, the country identifies it, is by those people who buy a plane ticket to Pakistan, wherever else, and seem to be mixing with the wrong guys. So why isn't it valuable to identify those people, maybe not as foreign fighters, as people who, how do you distinguish between the people who are foreign fighters and the people who want to go abroad for training? Let's start with that.
Well, I think it's difficult to know who goes for terrorist training and who goes for insurgency. And in many cases, I think you can't know because they don't know themselves, and it's something that they bump into along the way. But again, I'm not saying that we should not that we should not pay attention to this. I do think that we should follow, we should track flows of foreign fighters. When an Islamist of some kind travels ostensibly to a war zone, to a country near a war zone, we should pay attention. We should, but what I'm saying in the conclusion of the article is that we should distinguish between the outgoing foreign fighters and the returning ones. So we should pay attention when they leave, but we should focus most of our investigative resources when they come back. Because then at that point they will have, we can be more certain that there's a higher likelihood that there's quite motivation to attack.
Do you think there'd be something to be said between about distinguishing between those who go abroad allegedly as foreign fighters who seem to be followers and those who seem to be incipient leaders? In other words, there are other Americans of abroad who knows why they originally went over from Hamami to Fukushima, right? But those are people who you want to be paying attention to, perhaps before they go abroad, or at least while they're abroad, or not. Would you agree with that or not agree with that?
Yeah, but I think it's hard to identify that at an early stage. And in any case, a foot soldier can be very important if that foot soldier is the operative that enables the attack on the homeland. So you don't necessarily it's not necessarily the leaders who are going to come back and attack.
A number of Americans who have gone abroad for training, let's say for training to be, you define it, foreign fighters, more than foreign fighters, let's say the United States government considers them to have gone abroad for training, have come home. And they've come home not of their own free will. They've come home because they couldn't find a place to operate abroad. Can you tell us about them and what happens to them and how they figure into your thinking?
So for me, those cases are...
You might want to give some names of some of the cases you talked, because a lot of people in our audience will know them.
Right, well, I'm reluctant to get into sort of very specific cases, both because as an outsider who hasn't seen all the kind of in the classified evidence and all the really detailed in the communications sort of that may have gone on between the individuals in question. I will say that basically the fact that they go abroad first corroborates my argument that they acquired the motivation to fight abroad first. This is what most experts do. So they did that, and in some cases they were not able to link up with an organization, and they come back. Now, in some of those cases, it seems that there was the frustration with the inability to join a foreign group led them to start thinking about domestic operations. In other cases, it did not. So it's very hard to say what determines the decision to move on to a domestic case. And there's a related phenomenon of the cases of people who radicalize here, acquire the motivation to go abroad, declares it. We know that that was their initial intention, but they were for various reasons not able to go, practical reasons or something else. And then they later on developed the motivation to attack at home. And there, I'm speculating in the paper that this is about obstruction, that they do this after they've somehow been obstructed from becoming foreign fighters. But not all of those who are obstructed end up attacking. This is the problem, but some of them do. So, what do we make of this? How what inferences do we draw? How do we apply this in specific cases? I don't know the answer to that.
Talk about homegrown terrorism and your definition of homegrown terrorism. It's used very loosely by the press. It's used loosely by the government. It's used loosely by the expert community. What is your definition, and how much is your definition of homegrown terrorism as it applies to the United States the same or different as you would apply it to other countries?
Well, I hope to use the term homegrown terrorism as little as possible, because I think it's a fuzzy and not very useful term. Precisely because it lumps together a variety of phenomena that I think are partly distinct. It lumps together the domestic attackers, the domestic terrorists, and the foreign fighters, and perhaps other types of Islamists as well. So and this becomes very evident when you consider the following. So in most current definitions of homegrown terrorism, foreign fighters are included. So homegrown terrorism is when a U.S.-based person becomes a violent Islamist. It doesn't matter where he plans to fight or anything, as long as he becomes someone with violent intentions. Now, that means that if you look back in time, it means we should include. It means that any kind of example of people going abroad for foreign fighting in the past was also homegrown extremism. Now, if you look at the data, then there were hundreds, at least hundreds, maybe thousands of Americans who went out to fight in various wars abroad in the 80s and 90s, in Afghanistan, Bosnia, Afghanistan again. If you use this wide definition of homegrown terrorism, then you have to include these as well. So homegrown terrorism is something that's always been around, and until the recent kind of argument that homegrown terrorism is a recent phenomenon, something that's emerged in the late 2000s, becomes very problematic. Because, in fact, maybe it's on the decrease. Maybe there's been less homegrown terrorism overall in the 2000s than in the 1990s, because if you count all the foreign fighters in the 90s, then the number changed. So it's just not a very useful term. It doesn't help us identify this genuinely new phenomenon, which is a new phenomenon of individuals who acquire the motivation to attack here, more or less on their own.
Okay, so let's talk about going abroad to fight for a nationalist cause, right? You go. Okay, we're going to speak louder. So if you're a foreign fighter, you go abroad to fight for a nationalist cause. If you talk to a number of the heads of police departments and other distinguished law enforcement people in the United States, they will say, as you do in your study actually, that we have to be aware of these people when they return. But one of the things you say in the paper in your opening remarks is, but they're not going to return, but they don't return. But let me just ask you this question. Do they, for the most part, stay in the countries they go to fight in, or do they return home? And I'm talking about the United States.
So in my data, I think I have detailed enough data to isolate the U.S. And the exact population that foreign fighters from the U.S. But overall, like for the whole period, 1990 to 2010, at most 1 in 9 foreign fighters returned to attack. So I'm not saying that nobody returns. In fact, a 1 in 9 return rate is a pretty strong predictor of terrorism engagement. There are a few other biographical traits that has a similar sort of predictive factor. So it is important, but I think it's 1 in 9. I think is much lower than people have in their head when they think foreign fighters. Up until now.
And when they return, in your data, they are particularly lethal.
Yeah, so the plots they take part in are much more likely to succeed, and they're much more likely to kill people. So they are more effective killers. They are more dangerous. The ones who return. And
you still think the focus should be on the ones coming home, and not with the same focus on the ones going abroad because of that discrepancy.
That's right. So there's an additional distinction that's worth thinking about, and that is between destinations. So there's probably a difference between AFPAC and Somalia in this regard. So, and that's because one of the mechanisms by which people move on from foreign fighting to domestic fighting, one of the radicalization mechanisms out in the field is what I call enlistment. It's when an organization out there takes the Western jihadi and radicalizes him and sends him back for an operation. So this is Najibullah Zazi is a classic case. He initially went out with the intention to fight with the Taliban. Along the way, he's sucked into an Al-Qaeda training camp. He's trained, he's operationalized, sent back for an attack. It wasn't his initial intention, but he acquired it along the way, thanks to Al-Qaeda. And so this means that the presence of an organization with international ambitions like Al-Qaeda is important for the likelihood, or affects the likelihood that people who go to that region will come back. So in countries or in regions where you don't have those sort of groups, we can assume that the likelihood of people returning with an active attack plan is going to be lower. So I think that at least today, the likelihood of someone returning to attack is lower from Somalia than from AFPAC, for example. So we can start, but that's just an illustration of the type of terms in which we can start thinking about this problem. Once we've kind of made that initial distinction between domestic fighters and foreign fighters, now we can start thinking in more detailed terms about the foreign fighters. How do we distinguish between them? How do different destinations affect them differently, and so on.
Zazi's a good example. First of all, there are many who would argue that it's the most serious domestic terrorism case that we've seen since 9/11. It's a case that involved a whole bunch of conspirators, many of whom met somewhere in the AFPAC region, a number of whom had some affiliation with the United States, or whether they were citizens or not. And it was a pretty widespread plot, right, that covered this entire country. So, I mean, and you say that Zazi really went abroad to be a foreign fighter because he wanted to address international jihad or address the cause of Muslims. What was his ideological reason for fighting abroad? What drew him to being a foreign fighter?
Well, we can only judge by his own declarations and those of his friends, I find them convincing, and partly because they're consistent with a lot of other similar declarations. I think that he wanted to fight with the Taliban against ISAF forces. He wanted to partake in a local insurgency, fighting against enemies in uniform.
And did he talk about why? Do we know why? What motivated him? Was it any particular? Was it in support of Muslims and anti-Muslim policies worldwide? Was it because of American policies? What do we know?
Oh, well, that's also interesting that he's an Afghan, so he has a nationalist. It's not clear whether his motivation was nationalist or internationalist. It could have been either. It could have been both.
Right, that's why I wanted to just point that out. It is very hard. So one of the things you're critical of in your paper, at least correct me if I'm wrong, is U.S. law enforcement and some of the ways these cases play out. And actually you made a point I think it's pretty unique to you, which is what you think can happen in the process of the FBI getting involved with one of these individuals. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, the typical radicalization process follows a certain pattern. People first acquire the motivation to fight abroad, to participate in a relatively legitimate struggle abroad. And then some people later acquire the motivation to attack at home. But my point is that only some do that. So we cannot infer, so when someone displays an intention or motivation to go abroad to fight, we cannot infer from that he also intends to fight at home. That is just there's simply not evidence for that. And so what I think may have happened in some cases is that investigators have seen intentions or motivations to become a mujahid abroad, and they have assumed that this means that the person is very likely or is very likely to also attack at home, and that person is then treated as a plotting terrorist, whereas it's not clear at all whether that would have happened in all the cases, because statistically speaking, the number of people who move from one stage to the next is so small. Now, of course, I'm speaking in general terms, and in some cases it is. Some people do move on from one to the other for various reasons, but as a group, only the likelihood of moving on is relatively small.
But don't you also address the issue of FBI informants and how one of the things that happens with a terrorist or a potential terrorist or somebody who's in the process of maybe being radicalized is that in searching for some kind of answers about whether this is okay, whether from a religious point of view or an operational point of view, do you want to pick it up there?
Sure. Yeah. So basically, the way in which one common way in which people move from one stage to the next, from the foreign fighter stage to the domestic fighter stage, is through the influence of a veteran, influence of someone or someone senior, so someone charismatic or older, or someone with more experience, perhaps from foreign fighting, persuades that person that it's okay. We know that you have doubts about fighting here, because most of the literature says that you should have doubts and that you should not kill the civilians here. So we understand you have doubts, but listen to me. I know that it's wrong. I have these arguments for why you shouldn't worry and you should plot with me here. So that's what I call the veteran influence. I think it accounts for a number of cases in which people move sort of straight to terrorism here without going thought first. But no, my proposal, it's a hypothesis. I suspect that in some cases, informers can have the same effect as veterans in these cases. That they can act as that authority that reduces doubts that all or most early stage jihadists have about fighting at home. So left to their own devices, I think a majority of early stage jihadists will not move on to the domestic terrorist stage. They will stop, they will make attempts and perhaps leave for foreign fighting, but they will not necessarily move on to domestic fighting. But if someone comes along, a veteran or a very eager informant, that person can tip the balance. That person can help change that person's motivations.
Actually, that's a really interesting point, because if you look at the things that people look at to see whether it's entrapment or not, to see how these cases play out, what you generally look at are who chooses the target, who gets the idea, who chooses the weapons, who chooses the co-conspirators, who gets the idea of the co-conspirators. There's sort of a line, how much initiation the individual, the suspect himself, takes on as opposed to the FBI, and this changes from case to case. One thing that is very rarely looked at and that is important in these cases is where the ideological training comes in along the line. In other words, what is the conversation that goes on between the informant or the undercover and the individual themselves, and how much is about teaching about what a good Muslim is and how a good Muslim would behave in these circumstances. And we've seen, mishandling and non-mishandling of this in cases across the board. But something you're pointing to the larger conversation on entrapment would would improve with this in the mix, I think. I want to turn to some general like Al-Qaeda questions. They're outside of your paper, but as long as I have you here, these are things I want to know, okay? And I'll bet you people in the audience want to know. Which is, so let's start here. There's a lot of talk in the public space about the demise of Al-Qaeda. If it's not completely gone, it's bubbling down. Yes, we have Al-Qaeda or Al-Qaeda offshoots or Al-Qaeda something or others, but not the Al-Qaeda network in a variety of places in Africa. I'm curious, having spent the last 2 decades looking at Al-Qaeda, how you assess its potency, its worldwide reach, etc.
Well, I'm with Peter Bergen on this, that the Al-Qaeda organization is dying, that it's if not dead, it's at least very, very weak. But of course, it all comes down to how you define Al-Qaeda. So the Al-Qaeda Central, I think, is dying. We see it in the activity level, and in a host of other indicators. So that central organization is dying. But of course, there are affiliates, there are groups and individuals.
What do you mean affiliates? If the central core is dying, what is an affiliate? How we define an affiliate? They just decide by that it's an ideological affiliate?
Yes.
Is it a narrative affiliate? What?
Well, it's primarily an ideological affiliation. There's much debate about the role of the kind of the formal oath that leaders of some groups make to the leaders of Al-Qaeda Central. But I don't attach much importance to that. I think it doesn't really predict anything about the organization's behavior. But clearly there are organizations out there that express admiration for and respect for Al-Qaeda Central, and that disseminate their propaganda on the exact same websites that Al-Qaeda Central does, or did. So there's lots and lots of kind of ideological affinities with modifications. So what typically the affiliates don't have the exact same agenda as Al-Qaeda Central. They have a more of a local agenda. They don't consider attacking the West as the only priority, as Bin Laden did. So basically, Al-Qaeda Central is dying. The jihadi groups are, there's a broader kind of cluster of pro-Al-Qaeda jihadi groups are still around, more to varying degrees. And the, let's call it the Islamist movement, broadly speaking, is still also around. I mean, despite the Arab Spring, I think that the sort of Islamist zeitgeist is not gone. It's still there. There are still activists, parties, groups, framing their political struggle, be it violent or non-violent, in religious terms. And I'm less optimistic than many about the life or the coming demise of Islamism more broadly. And in a sense, I think we've been misled a little bit by the notion of waves. Some of you may know David Rappaport's famous theory about the 4 waves of terrorism, the anarchist and anti-colonialist, leftist, and now religious or Islamist. It implies that these ideologies have an expiration date, and that they can only last so long. And I've kind of been sympathetic to this theory, but at times I have doubts. When I look back in time, there have been militant Islamists around for a very long time, 1930s, 1940s, perhaps less so in the 50s, the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, there have been militant Islamists around. We haven't been kind of prominent in the history books because we didn't look for them as as actively as we do today. But this is I don't think that all forms of Islamism and jihadism are going to go away anytime soon. But the ones, the organizations that systematically target the US and the West are going to be gone for a little while, I think.
And this is because of?
It's basically because they're weaker than the states. They're weaker than our state. So this happens to all terrorist groups. So terrorist groups have an advantage at the beginning of their campaign because they have the governments they're fighting against doesn't know them. It takes but after a while the government learns about them and their strength starts to decline because as the government learns. So it's basically a learning process. And I think it's fair to say that we have learned a lot about Al-Qaeda Central over the past 10 years. And when I say we, I include the academic community, but not least the intelligence community. Really, I think, knows Al-Qaeda Central very well now, and to a much greater extent than we did in 2001, 2002. So just have this enormous advantage.
So I'm going to open up for questions. I have one more question that may have a few questions embedded in it, and that is about Norway. So can you explain to us why the Norwegian Defense Ministry decided that it needed a think tank on these matters?
Well, I should clarify that the group of scholars who work for terrorism we're not the whole institution. So this is an institution that's been around since the 1940s. It has 700 employees, 98% of which is technical. And so there's a small social science division, and in that small social science division there's a group of 4 or 5 people who work on terrorism. So in the late 90s, some visionary research director decided that terrorism is an interesting topic. There seems to be an asymmetric warfare seems to be on the rise. Why don't we have a person look at this for a little while? A research project of 3 years, and then along came 9/11, and we expanded a little bit. But I think that the secret to it is just stability, financial stability, letting scholars, giving scholars the time to just to study this phenomenon for a relatively long period of time, forcing them to chase around for money, spending 60% of their time fundraising instead of doing the research. I think that's the main.
And this one final tag on to this, which is your study looks at radicalization, recruitment, all of that. But what about de-radicalization? Are you looking at de-radicalization?
No, I don't. I don't in this study. And I haven't done much in my other work either. So I have to defer to other specialists on that. People like John Hogan, people like Omar Ashur, who say that the de-radicalization process is not the negative of the radicalization process. It's not the same. It's not, you can't just take away the factors that re-radicalize someone and then they will de-radicalize. It's a different dynamic. It has to be approached differently.
Okay, I have a few more, but let's give them a chance and then we can come back. So, your questions? Anybody? I can't see. Way in the back. Bob. You're going to have to just stand up and speak.
Okay. In the case of the Somalis, which is probably the largest group of Americans who've gone overseas to do foreign fighting, what I was told was that there were very few Somali Americans and Somalis who were living in the U.S. who were actually going there to fight as Islamists. They were going there to fight as Somali nationalists because either they believed the Ethiopians were involved or that they anticipated the Ethiopians would be involved in the internal disputes in Somalia. Is that something that is reflected elsewhere in your research? Are there other countries where you see the majority of those going overseas to be nationalists rather than Islamists?
It's a good question. I have a good answer. And that's in part because the phenomenon that you're describing is what I call co-ethnic foreign fighting. So it's when someone goes and fights in the country of their family. And I think this is a slightly different phenomenon from the non-co-ethnic variety.
But they're lumped together.
They're lumped together in this study for practical reasons. And the thing is about co-ethnic foreign fighting is that it's generally underreported. We pay much more attention to the Somalis because they're Islamists. So the phenomenon of kind of diaspora support, members of the community in diaspora somehow supporting the struggle at home is very widespread. It's always been around in various conflicts in the past 50 years. But I think it's generally underreported. But few people have sat down to count the flows of the Lebanese to Lebanon in the late 70s, early 80s, or Sri Lanka, Tamils to Sri Lanka, and other. So I think there's a strong underreporting of co-ethnic foreign fighting. But it doesn't really affect my argument. If anything, it just makes it corroborates it even more, because it means that the number of foreign fighters is even larger, and that the ratio is even more skewed. So, a long way of saying that I don't have any sort of good examples, but I strongly suspect that this is very common.
Other questions? Way in the back.
Hi, this has been fascinating. Thank you very much. I wanted to ask, how do these people view being caught, and what is the best way to approach them when we do catch them? There was a wonderful program here earlier about Zero Dark 30 and the whole role of enhanced interrogation. And Ali Sufan said, terrorists view U.S. jails as a piece of cake vis-a-vis an Egyptian capture situation. What would be the best way to approach them and turn them, and doesn't enhanced interrogation work? If not, why not?
Important question, but I can't really answer it. There are so many people who can answer it better than me. I generally have not studied.
Let me ask it a different way. I was going to do something at the end, so I want to bounce off of that a little bit. Don't worry, relax. I can tell I'm making it. No. So, most of us, when we think about Norway and terrorism, don't think about jihadi extremism, right? We think, in the United States, we think about your experience with terrorism and Anders Breivik. So it's interesting. So maybe you should talk a little bit about how Norway dealt with the phenomenon of terrorism on its own soil in what Americans would define as homegrown terrorism, somebody of the country attacking the country, and just what happened and what the response was. And I think that's a better question for you along the same lines of what to do with a terrorist.
Yeah, that's a very good point. The response, as you probably most of you know, was I would say relatively measured compared to most government responses to terrorism, but there's a reason for that. It's not because we're particularly good-hearted. It's not. I think that there's a good sort of structural reason why that was the case. But let me just describe it first and explain it after. So the response took the form of I would say it took a positive twist. People were going to emphasize the positive elements of society, and emphasized the importance of inclusion. there were few calls for hardening, tightening of laws, for example, reintroduction of the death penalty. People were writing about this on social media, of course, venting their frustration, but there were no serious calls for the introduction of the death penalty, for example. And fortunately, we have a system that allows for life imprisonment. There's a misunderstanding that Breivik only got 21 years in prison. He has a life sentence de facto, because the sentence can be renewed every 10 years, and it will be. So, fortunately, I think if we didn't have that mechanism in place, and that there was no way of giving him a very lengthy sentence, I think that it would have looked different. But and there was a general consensus that this has to be done in a regular court and treated as a criminal act. Now, why? The main reason is that he was alone. He didn't have an organization behind him, and we understood that very quickly. That takes away a lot of it takes away the terror in terrorism. The reason why terrorism works and the reason why states overreact to terrorism is that they suspect that there's more coming. If there's nothing more coming, there's no reason to be afraid. So this is the key difference between 9/11 and 22nd of July. On 9/11, big attack, and 1,000 trained hostile warriors in Afghanistan, keen to carry out more attacks. An organization whose main objective was to continue to attack Americans. Whereas Breivik, one attack, there's nothing there. He's alone. There's no organization behind him. He talks about an organization, but for all, it seems to be just in his own mind. So that's the main reason. We had no reason to worry. And I think that the response would have been very different had it been an Islamist attack. Had it been a jihadi attack in the center of Oslo, we would have not been the sort of the nice, sweet Scandinavians that you perhaps think that we are.
I wonder if you sort of comment on.
Can you speak up?
Yes, I wonder if you would comment on sort of the heart of this sort of distinction, right, between foreign fighters and terrorism, right? I mean, in surveying all of this material, right, over 2 decades, is it because of a kind of religious, cultural, jihadi factor that it may lead one to say, well, it's inevitable that you're going to have this foreign fighter sort of phenomenon, right? And is it perhaps memory of earlier jihads, perhaps most notably the Afghan jihad and the literature that it produced, and poetry, and even the interest in women, Afghan women, that drove a lot of the young Arab men there? Or is it the earlier jihads in Islamic history? I wonder if you'd comment a bit about the culture of all of this.
I just want to repeat the question. So basically he's asking, the big question, the big elephant in the room is, why do people become jihadi terrorists, and what's the difference between long-term roots of this and the more current politically motivated, or whatever motivated? No?
Not entirely. I'm curious just more about the sort of religious culture that drives them, and what sorts of comments and things that they talk about culturally, I mean, speaking, and whether that's something that you see as inevitable.
So the central idea, I think, in the non-co-ethnic foreign fighting is pan-Islamism. The notion that every Muslim has a responsibility to intervene and help a fellow Muslim in need. For the co-ethnic foreign fighters, it's probably that and nationalism. With the co-ethnic foreign fighting, the nationalist motivation is as old as nations. For the non-co-ethnic one, the pan-Islamist ones, is a different story, I think. And this was the topic of another previous article of mine that looked at why foreign fighters has varied over time, why it's become so prominent in the past two decades. Why is it, for example, that people went in the thousands to Afghanistan in the 80s, but they didn't go in the thousands to other wars in the Muslim world, where Muslims were fighting non-Muslims, say the Philippines or Palestine in the 60s. Why this urge to help other Muslims in the 80s and 90s and not before? And I explained that by pointing to the growth of the broader sort of ideological movement from the late 70s onward that emphasizes this pan-Islamic solidarity. And I suggest that this ideological movement has an organizational root. It's rooted in the fact that you have Islamists in exile in Saudi Arabia, politically conscious individuals, activists, in exile in Western Saudi Arabia with nothing to do other than to militate on the international arena. So they become active in these international Islamic organizations and start saying that it's the Ummah that matters and we should all help each other. And that kind of pan-Islamist idea was interpreted in a military sense by influential ideologues like Abdullah Azam and others, and it becomes in some circles interpreted as meaning that you should fight to help other Muslims in need. So it's something that emerges particularly in the 1970s onward, and it may. I'm not saying it will always be there. I'm not saying that foreign fighting will always be there. I think that pan-Islamist ideal might dissipate in the future. But what I'm saying is that the jihadi in the very simple descriptive sense of violent Islamists. So there will be violent activists in the Muslim world acting, legitimizing their struggle in religious terms for a very long time. Need not be global, need not be anti-Western, but there will be militant Islamist activists in the region for a long time.
I haven't given this a lot of thought, but it prompted me when you said something. You said that terrorism depends upon your having an organization in back of you. And I thought about that, and I thought about that perhaps terrorism also relates to the particular act that takes place. It seems that terrorism is meant to terrorize. And so if you use the example of Newton, Connecticut, the gunman actually went and shot individual people. If you set off a bomb in the middle of Yankee Stadium, there's no individual person who's targeted, and it seems that creates the terror, because nobody is targeting me. It's up to the gods, so to speak, as to whether I know God. So I think that to some extent, terrorism depends upon the act as well as whether you have an organization.
Sure. I mean, this is an element of most definitions of terrorism. That there's a distinction between the victim and the target. So you just blow up a bus. It's not the individual people in that bus that the group is after. It's the population from which they're drawn. They are the target of the psychological act.
Weren't you saying that it depends upon having an organization in back of you?
Well, I'm saying that there need to be an expectation of more violence. So this is why. Well, I would say that the school shootings, they're not well, some of them may be targeted, but often they're not. So, but they don't have the same effect of terrorism because we know they're random. So they're in most cases they're caused by mental illness, which is unpredictable for most people, and so it's like a natural disaster. And so even though in those cases too, there's no deliberate targeting of identified people. Some cases there, but in many cases there's not. You don't get the same terror effect. The terror effect you get from by convincing people that there is more coming. And by the way, it need not be like a formal organization. It's enough to have a movement. So that's why you have this notion of leaderless resistance and that sort of thing. So when an unaffiliated jihadi attacks, we're very afraid because we think there are more like him. even though it is not part of an organization in the very strict sense.
Just following up on that, with Breivik, who was basically, as you described, a lone wolf, a lone killer, who went out and kind of randomly, even though he had his own ideas in his mind, was declared mentally ill during the court proceedings. As you said, Norway took that as, well, there could be more like this, but we're not going to do anything. There's nothing we can do about it because it's random. Is that following in the same line of thinking? Also,
very simply
like
put.
Newtown, also children, also, I mean,
No, I think there's a difference between Newtown and Uttaya. There's there's much more. I mean, there's much more doubt about Breivik's insanity, and I mean, the psychiatric community in Norway was divided, split in the middle over this, the last word has not been said in the matter. Over time, we'll maybe we'll know more, but as we can observe it over a longer period of time. But he was clearly much more political. He wrote a long manifesto and made a video, etc. So he wanted also to create the impression that more was coming.
just remember that the Newtown person, I agree, didn't think there was more coming, but his computer was wiped clean, so we actually don't know.
That's true.
Okay. Dan, did you have a question?
Can I just interject that it only illustrates my point that so we're all now waiting to see what was on the computer. So if there was nothing, we sigh with relief. If there's something, then we're worried.
I'm worried either way. But
Okay.
If I understood you correctly, you said earlier that your studies of foreign fighters and those that return home leads you to make a suggestion to national security establishment in a country like America, and that is pay less attention to those that are leaving and more attention to those that are coming back. I mean, correct me if I misstated that, but
Not quite. I'm saying you should pay attention to both, but handle them differently. Handle them with coercive means.
okay, good. I guess that's my question is, what do you say, I mean, from a practical perspective, what are we doing, I guess we being the United States, what are we doing with the foreign fighters that leave that you think we need to do? I mean, specifically, and then when they, I mean, if we stop doing whatever that is, in what ways does that disadvantage us when they come back? Because we have no idea maybe, or we know less about what they've been up to for however many years they've been out. So we have, I guess, less of an ability to determine how dangerous these people may be.
Right. So again, I'm not saying that we should not pay attention to them, and that we should just let them go and wait for them to come back. We should. I think it's possible now with in this day and age to keep an eye on personnel movements to an extent that it wasn't possible in the 80s and 90s. What I'm saying is that I may be wrong. I haven't studied all the legal cases in great detail, but I know that there have been cases of people who have attempted to go abroad, and they've been charged with material support for terrorism on that intention, on that attempted travel. The people who've not even made it to the battlefront or to the organization. Now, I think that in some cases, not all cases, in some cases that may be unnecessarily coercive, and I think that it's a problem insofar as it sours relations with the Muslim community, and that it obviously more from a kind of pure CT perspective, more is always better, harder is always better. If you you can incarcerate all Islamists, and that would probably reduce it might reduce the incidence of terrorism in the short term. But what I'm saying is that a more nuanced approach to this, a less coercive approach to those phenomena that seem to be less of a security concern on the homeland, could help us build better relations could help improve relations between, for example, law enforcement and the Muslim community, which in turn may have actually positive effects for counterterrorism.
We're going to take two questions. You have some questions? So Bert and then over here. We're going to take them at the same time. No, not you, but we'll get you.
Yes, I understand your distinction between foreign fighters, jihadists, which I think is useful. But going back to the bus bomb, the target is not the general population. The target is some policy. And the concept is to get the general population, to get the country to change the policy. Dropping the bomb on Hiroshima, in that sense, was terrorism. So with regard to the commonality, the common strand between jihadists, unless you take the view of some that Islam demands a jihad against the West, or foreign fighters, or co-ethnic fighters, I wonder if it might be more useful, or also useful, to focus on the policies that the people using the violence or training for violence are trying to change. And from the U.S. point of view, whether that might get us to focus more, on, at least in some countries, on the policies that are creating terrorist tactics, rather, as now, we're focusing on how we can work with the governments that impose those policies to somehow fight terrorists.
And another question, and then
Wasn't there a question there?
Yeah.
I thought there.
No, we're going to take two at the same time.
Oh, sorry. Is it too simplistic to ask you in the professional community of working in the jihadist Muslim Qaeda movement that it's largely anti-American, or how do you view it? I'm not talking about the bus bombings that are just destroying the Islamic world, Islam on Islam, Shia versus Sunni, but apropos of this country, do you see the Al-Qaeda movements largely oriented towards anti-Americanism or not?
Would you mind just rephrasing? I didn't quite catch that.
I'm wondering how much of anti-Americanism within the Qaeda Islamic movement is anti-American.
Right. But those are both good questions, but they're hard to answer. I mean, so it touches upon what are the root causes of terrorism, and there are two problems with the root causes kind of approach. One is that there's no consensus on what the root causes are, and I think it's and what evidence we have, it does not at all clearly suggest that it's the declared aims or objectives of the terrorists that are really causing the violence. So that's one problem. The other problem is with the practical one, that often these are such big decisions, or such big issues that they often cannot be changed, or they require a big political process to change. So Al-Qaeda's objective: expel all Westerners, all Western individuals and economic interests from the Muslim world. You could do that, but it could be very complicated, and it's not clear that would help, that would stop all Al-Qaeda's violence. But that is their declared aim, that is their objective. So should we? It's certainly not something that that's realistic in the near future. But, so to the question about anti-Americanism, well, the Al-Qaeda attacks in America are the ultimate expression of anti-Americanism. So clearly, that's motivating those individuals. The real question is, of course, and I think this is what you mean, is how prevalent is anti-Americanism in broader kind of jihadi, Islamist, Muslim communities. I see this as concentric circles of Al-Qaeda, jihadis, Islamists, and Muslim. And well, there's a measurement problem in how do you measure anti-Americans, but it doesn't. You don't need to be a social scientist or a pollster to know that there's a lot of anti-Americanism across the Muslim world, and especially in the Islamist community, and very especially in the jihadi community. The problem though is that not all of that a lot of people have anti-American views, but they don't necessarily act on them, or they don't think it's legitimate for others to act on them. I think that it's the question, I suppose, that's another elephant in the room is whether American foreign policy is causing this, whether it's the aggressive American actions in the Muslim world that's causing it. And I think it's a truth with a lot of modifications, and the main reason is that let's call it the reality of the objective military actions in the Muslim world. This objective reality is interpreted and reshaped, and things are twisted around and presented in a slightly different way by ideologues and by technology, like audiovisual propaganda technology. With these tools, ideologues can take elements of the objective reality and create a worldview that's completely twisted, and suggest causal connections that are not real. And so, even though those elements are objective, those elements are real, it doesn't mean that that those elements are causing it. The real kind of there's an agency here in the ideologues who pick and choose from the objective elements and construct a worldview that motivates people. Yeah, just a final note that this, but also at the same time, this also doesn't mean that the objective realities are completely irrelevant. You shouldn't say that we can't conclude that it's all about the ideologues, because the fact of the matter is it's easier to be an ideologue if you have more elements to choose from. It's easier. Your twisted worldview is more likely to gain more support if it's empirically credible. If the people recognize and kind of agree with more of the elements.
I was wondering if you could talk to the importance of the actual travel that you're speaking about. The Department of Justice, because of the FBI, talks about lots of the cases that Professor Greenberg has studied as international terrorism cases, even though there's no discrete nexus to international terrorism. In fact, a lot of them are, born here, arrested here, and the nexus is sort of viewing something online, or looking at lots of tapes, or believing something that is sympathetic to the global jihadist movement that you've said so much about, and I'm not sure why we're only talking about that global movement, but that's another question. So I wonder sort of what you think about sort of the presence of the internet in all of this as something that's very relevant to the government, as attaching some people here at home to the global movement without even leaving their parents' bedrooms. I wonder if you have something to say about that.
That's a very good question, and that's the internet is probably one factor behind the relative increase in home and domestic attacks. So what I mentioned earlier, the ratio between foreign fighting and domestic fighting. Is,
Not domestic attacks, but plans for domestic.
yeah, plans for plans.
Thoughts about
That's
plans.
right. Yeah, yeah. Good point.
Important distinction.
Yes. And so yes, so the internet increases that has increased that motivation in more people, and there's no doubt that the internet does that. Where the travel, what the travel factor means is more effective attacks, more deadly attacks. That's the key. That's in a nutshell the main difference. So yes, the internet and the internet propaganda may make more people willing to carry out attacks against the US, but so long as they don't acquire hands-on training and expert advice on bomb-making, their attacks will be less lethal and it will be less of a problem. So so many people speak of this internet or the sort of decentralized Al-Qaeda movement as a deliberate, a new, very dangerous strategy by Al-Qaeda, a deliberate decision that's even more dangerous than the old organized model. I think that's not true. I think, yes, Al-Qaeda has encouraged more decentralized operations, but it's the second best choice. It's a realization that the centralized organized model is not feasible today. So the only thing they can do is decentralize it. But so they sacrifice effectiveness for security. And so that's where the travel comes into the picture. That it can, for those so motivated, it enhances their capability.
I think we're out of time. I just want to remind you that on March 18th, we have a day-long conference on 21st century warfare, law, the enemy, and the battlefield. We will look at the authorization to use military force and what allows the United States to say something's Al-Qaeda and go after it, because that's actually what we're authorized to do. We will look at the expanding notion of the enemy in the Middle East, in the AFPAC region, in Africa. We will be looking at cyber war, and we will be looking at predator drones, the law and the policy behind them. We have a lot of very well-known speakers coming, so you should go on the web. But I will tell you that our keynote speaker is Jay Johnson, who is the former, a couple weeks ago, General Counsel of the Pentagon, who will have some rather interesting things to say about how the United States should proceed going forward. So that's on March 18th. It's a full day. Come, stay, come back, whatever you like. Please join me in thanking Thomas Hegghammer for coming.